Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back to Potomac Watch. We are sizing up the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Another thing that General Milley said this week is that the lack of air power on the Ukrainian side wasn't really the problem that the Ukrainians are having. It's really more these mines that we're discussing that are so dangerous and time-consuming to clear out. Of course, I don't want to underplay the real problem that the mines are posing, but the reason the Ukrainians need air power is to take this fight on the offensive. F-16s would be a big improvement for what Ukraine has. Got a little bit of electronic protection. They could go after Russian surface air missile sites. They could fire longer range weapons, provide close air support to troops. Jillian is right that when NATO does combined arms, that includes a lot of help from air power. And the Ukrainians simply don't have that advantage right now. We would view that as essential to our warfighting plans. The Biden administration, of course, has been on a long, meandering path to training F-16 pilots. You could have put F-16 pilots from Ukraine in American flight schools a year ago, but we elected not to do that. And now we are in this potentially weaker position as a result. We are supposed to see some training of these pilots starting in August, but that will still take time to get them up and running. Joe, I'd be interested in your broad thoughts on this offensive and how it's going, and as you see Europe and what they might donate to the fight that could have an immediate impact.
Well, I think one of the key facts about the counteroffensive is that it is still running. And I think that despite all of this carping about whether or not it is going as well for the Ukrainians as one might have hoped, I think that the key fact, as you and Jillian have certainly pointed out, is that you have a much smaller military power here on the Ukrainian side, really effectively keeping the Russians on their toes, despite the fact that the Russians are the much bigger military. And also, this was a war of the Russians' choice. And I think that that situation matters a lot from the European perspective, because the thing that has been crucial to mobilizing Western European support for Ukraine, often support that was not necessarily what you would have expected at the beginning of this conflict. What has been crucial to mobilizing that support has been seeing that the Ukrainians are consistently willing and able to fight with the resources that they are given. And I think maintaining that kind of momentum and the Ukrainians being prepared to keep up the pressure in any form on the Russians is going to be very important, particularly as we start heading into the autumn and Europe again finds itself worrying about various energy and other economic issues that are following on as consequences from the war, because I think that that will be one of the ways that the Ukrainians can continue to mobilize the degree of political support that they need in Western Europe to keep unlocking more of the weapon shipments and other aid.
Right. Jillian, we hear from Biden a lot that we will support Ukraine, quote, as long as it takes. He never really specifies what it means. To our listeners who are watching this, wondering what success would look like for the Ukrainians, how do you rate that? I think we've been describing how this was always going to be a slog, kilometer by kilometer, of taking back territory. But how should our listeners think about whether this Ukrainian counteroffensive is a success?
Well, I think that what we've seen so far is that the Ukrainians are regaining territory. They have taken back a lot more territory throughout the war than anyone expected. But I think it is also notable, even though the counteroffensive has been slower than some in the West would like, they've accomplished more than the Russians were able to accomplish this entire winter. When I talk to my Ukrainian sources, they say that victory is taking back all of Ukrainian territory. That includes Crimea, that includes Luhansk, that includes Donetsk. And they're very emphatic about that point. That's something that I hear, too, from the families of Ukrainian soldiers, including some of those who passed away. They say that this fight is to liberate the entirety of Ukraine and that they don't want any of their countrymen trapped under Russian rule where they're going to be brutalized and tortured. So, I mean, that is the Ukrainian position. I think what the West needs to start thinking about is, what does victory look like from a Western perspective? And Ukraine is not going to quit fighting until it is certain that it can defend its territory. I mean, it is very concerned about a settlement that is foisted upon Ukraine that basically gives exhausted Russian military a chance to recuperate, to review what went wrong, and to reattack. So that's the concern and the anxiety that I'm hearing when I talk to Ukrainian sources.
Sure. I want to shift to the politics a little bit, because I think one of the long-term risks of the Biden strategy of sort of calibrating what weapons we give to Ukraine to how they think the Russians might respond and moving in this slow manner has been that over time, political support for Ukraine would start to atrophy, both in Europe and in America. I will note the polls we're seeing so far don't show the Ukraine fatigue that we hear about from some particularly loud voices online. A survey earlier this year said that 3/4 of Americans think it's important to the U.S. that Ukraine wins the war. And that included 86% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans. So that's a pretty broad consensus. I also wanted to bring up a new poll out this week showing that 54% of Americans support Ukraine's inclusion in NATO. And 73% say that NATO is essential for American security. That suggests to me that the Trump view, anti-NATO view, is a real political loser with more depth than even I might have expected. Joe, do you think the resolve for supporting Ukraine is durable in the coming months? You mentioned the energy issue in Europe. If Ukraine's not looking like they're winning, is this going to be sustainable, or is there more durable support than maybe most analysts appreciate?
Well, okay, so it's true that the things that can undermine support for Ukraine, especially in Western Europe, would be if we have a particularly difficult winter where the temperatures are much colder than they were last year and the natural gas supplies are less and the prices are higher. So that is definitely a political danger. But against that, you set what a learning experience this has been for large sections of the electorate, both in Western Europe and in the US. And you ask yourself, what are the things that voters have learned watching the situation? First off, they have discovered that Vladimir Putin in Russia is a threat to the safety and security, and in fact, the territorial integrity of the European continent. And don't underestimate, particularly in Europe, how shocking it has been, this idea that for the first time in 80 years, you have a war of this scale happening on European soil. So I think that that has been a learning experience that is really shaping a lot of public opinion on this issue. The brutality of the Russian war, tracing all the way back to April last year when the first photos of the war crimes in the Ukrainian village of Bucha started appearing, I think has really brought home to people what are the stakes here? What is the nature of the regime that we have to protect ourselves against? And I think that in America, there is also this realization, an argument we have made on the Journal for many years, that actually NATO is cheap at the price in terms of the benefits that the U.S. gets from it. So we clearly have strategic and economic interests in Europe's security. And here we have an example of how a relatively modest investment financially and in terms of the military equipment that we have been sending to Ukraine is yielding these huge returns in terms of our ability to unsettle an adversary in the Kremlin and create a lot of problems for that adversary and potentially create a situation where Europe will be more secure at the end of this as a result of having humbled Ukraine in this war, in which, remind ourselves, Americans are not being asked to fight. And so I think it's the combination of all of that is creating a political environment that is reminding people what our European alliances are actually worth, and also how important Europe's security is to America and not just to our European allies.
Right. You know, this has been a particular discussion in the Republican Party. On Hugh Hewitt this morning, he asked Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, is the section of the party that supports Ukraine about 70%, while 30% want to cut and run? Is that about the divide that it is? DeSantis said it was closer to 50-50, and he hears a lot about Republican concerns that the American political class isn't focused enough on problems at home. I've been making the argument that this is not a mutually exclusive choice, and that also defending Ukraine and giving them weapons at the price of no American life, to Joe's point, is a good deal for U.S. security, and that keeping Putin from getting closer to that Polish border as Poland increases its defense spending to try to defend itself is a good thing for the West. Jillian, I'd be curious your thoughts on reaching that audience who is skeptical of U.S. support for Ukraine. As you cover the war, what do you think the most compelling arguments are that this is in the U.S. interest? Because Biden isn't making that case, and someone needs to speak to this group of Americans who's skeptical of this support.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I were going to persuade them, the first thing I'd do is put them on the phone with some of the people that I'm talking to. You talk to these Ukrainian soldiers, many of them are quite young. We're talking guys in their early 20s. And the way they talk about American ideals is it's inspiring. They know what freedom costs and they're willing to stand and fight for it. They want what the West has. And there's this yearning for freedom that just on an emotional level is very compelling. So I'd put that aside. There is also a rational argument for this. When I talk to those Ukrainians, they are absolutely emphatic. They don't want Americans or the West fighting their war. They are willing to fight. They're basically just saying, give me the gun and I can take this guy out. If we look at what we've invested in the war in Ukraine, it is so small as a portion of our military budget, as a portion of what the U.S. spent on COVID. It's a really small investment, as you said, and it's yielding these enormous results in degrading the Russian military and taking out a threat. It's also, by the way, I think a deterrent for China. And you have to keep in mind, too, I mean, Vladimir Putin's ambitions do not stop in Ukraine. If he is able to take that, there are concerns about him pushing further into territory, potentially NATO territory. And that's when you see potentially U.S. military commitment. I think we have to nip this in the bud right now. We're doing it at low cost, and we're doing it with people that deeply and profoundly share our ideals. And that's strategically important.
Thanks so much, Jillian. Thanks, Joe, for joining me. We'll be back tomorrow with more from Potomac Watch.